Before the sun could rise, 50 Burkinabè soldiers were already gone. Not from disease, not from natural disaster, but from a brutal surgical military strike. No warning, no time to defend, just silence. And then fire. And yet what followed was not collapse, but a call to arms unlike anything the African continent has seen in generations. Welcome to Heroic Africa. Today we are not telling you about a protest or a speech. We are witnessing the birth of a doctrine, a warning, a retaliation. President Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old captain turned head of state, stood at the funeral of his fallen men, not just as a leader but as a brother in arms. And instead of bowing his head to Western condolences, he raised his fist. Then quietly, something extraordinary began. Drone missiles are now being built inside Burkina Faso. Russian special forces have landed. And across the plains of West Africa, the people are no longer waiting for protection. They are becoming it. So let me ask you, if 50 of your sons were taken from you by forces cloaked in silence and denial, what would you do? This isn't about revenge. This is about survival, about dignity. And for the first time in decades, the world is seeing a new kind of African leadership, one that refuses to kneel and one that prepares to strike not just with weapons, but with unity, technology, and national spirit. Stay with us as we uncover the full story behind what may become a turning point in African history. Subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. Share if you stand with President Ibrahim Traoré and the right of every nation to defend itself from the shadows. It began with a stillness too perfect to trust. In the early hours before dawn, a military base near Burkina Faso's eastern corridor, the kind of place where routine meets fatigue, was thrown into chaos. Surveillance drones had gone dark. Communications were silent. Guards on night patrol saw nothing, heard nothing until the air exploded. The attack was fast, merciless, and left no chance to fight back. Over 50 Burkinabè soldiers were killed in what analysts now call one of the most precise ambushes in Sahel military history. Bodies were scattered across concrete and dirt. Reinforcements jammed by signal interference arrived too late. And yet, the horror of the event was not just in its brutality, but in its timing. Just days earlier, a high-level delegation from the United States had visited Burkina Faso. The purpose to invite President Ibrahim Traoré to Washington, D.C. to receive an achievement award in recognition of his government's leadership in development and anti-terrorism. But Traoré refused. No press conference, no polite decline, just a flat rejection delivered with the kind of conviction that leaves no room for negotiation. The same week, an American-backed NGO arrived in Ouagadougou seeking a closed-door meeting with the presidency. They were turned away at the gate. The president would not meet them. No photo ops, no speeches, no smiles. And then, the ambush. To many inside Burkina Faso, this was not coincidence. To the public, this was retaliation, not by Traoré, but against him. Within hours of the news breaking, whispers became shouts. Was this punishment for refusing to play ball with the West State media? Didn't name names. The official investigation remains open. But the streets had already reached their conclusion. Posters of the 50 fallen were plastered on city walls. Radio hosts wept live on air. And in Ouagadougou's central square, thousands of citizens gathered, fists in the air, chanting not just in grief, but in defiance. Schools closed, flags were lowered, and the president, often elusive, careful, calculating, appeared before the nation not from a podium, but in uniform. There was no speech, only silence. And then a single sentence, never again. Behind-the-scenes preparations began. In a forgotten corner of the capital, an old repair facility once used to maintain civilian transport vehicles was sealed off from the public. Engineers, mostly in their 20s, were brought in under tight surveillance. The building was stripped of its old equipment. And then, like the turning of a page, a new purpose emerged. The site became a military manufacturing hub, discreet, indigenous, controlled entirely by Burkinabè forces. And what they were building was no secret drones. Attack drones, surveillance drones, counterintelligence drones, not imported, not donated, built from scratch, designed not only to monitor borders, but to strike when necessary. In the weeks following the funeral, 5 drone squadrons were placed under active development. One of them, codenamed Kugri 1, is already operational, flying silent loops over the vulnerable northern border with sensors equipped for night surveillance and AI-guided targeting. The message to the world: we are no longer waiting for help, we are building it. And Traoré was not doing it alone. 48 hours after the funeral, Russian special forces landed quietly in Ouagadougou. They didn't arrive with cameras. They didn't post on social media. They went straight to work, training, coordinating, and simulating drone warfare scenarios with Burkinabè troops. It wasn't an occupation. It wasn't charity. It was something more dangerous, an alliance. Sources close to the military say that what's unfolding is not just a tactical reaction. It's the first phase of a new national doctrine, one rooted in self-defense, but loaded with the symbolism of sovereignty. And the soldiers, you'd think the loss of 50 comrades would demoralize a national army. Instead, enlistment spiked. Young men from Kaya, young women from Bobo Dioulasso farmers' teachers, even university dropouts began registering in record numbers. But the most striking development wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the hearts of civilians. Parents brought their children to military parades not to fear war, but to honor sacrifice. Local chiefs donated land for training grounds. Fishermen offered boats for border patrol. Even spiritual leaders, from Muslim imams to Christian pastors and traditional griots, held united ceremonies of protection and remembrance. Something was shifting. This was no longer about one attack or one president. This was about a nation waking up to the reality of a world that punishes defiance and deciding collectively that it would rather be punished than be passive. The Retaliation Doctrine. In most countries, retaliation means a press statement, maybe a border skirmish, a few arrests or sanctions. But in Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré, retaliation has taken on an entirely new meaning. It started quietly beneath the industrial hum of Ouagadougou's repurposed factories. But the speed, scale, and spirit behind what followed stunned even longtime observers of West African politics. Inside what was once a repair center, now reborn as a drone laboratory, military engineers, some barely out of university, began working in shifts. Blueprints were drawn for unmanned aerial systems. Circuits were soldered, targeting software tested. Each drone wasn't just a machine, it was a message. We will never be caught off guard again. Traoré didn't import these drones. He didn't ask NATO for training. Instead, he called upon Russian specialists, not mercenaries, but advisors. They arrived in silence, not with contracts, but with combat experience. Their goal was not to fight for Burkina Faso, but to train Burkina Faso to fight for itself. Together, they drafted a sweeping plan, now known internally as Operation Culpelgo. It wasn't just a military operation. It was a national transformation strategy with 3 pillars: civilian preparedness, border technological fortification, strategic domestic arms production. Traoré redirected $300 million from international aid budgets and reallocated them into domestic military innovation. The move shocked donors, rattled NGOs, and drew fire from international observers. But to the Burkinabè public, it was one word: justice. Across the hills of Kaya and the riverbanks of Fata Ngurma, something unexpected began to happen. The sound of hammers replaced sermons. Blacksmiths returned to forges not to build plows, but symbolic blades of protection. Hunters offered terrain knowledge for defense patrols. Women's cooperatives stitched new uniforms from traditional fabrics. In towns and villages, community defense councils emerged, blending ancient war customs with modern surveillance. Traditional warriors, once sidelined by colonial shame, now led marches again. But this time, not to fight neighbors. They marched to protect their nation from foreign destabilization. Students planted freedom trees, one for each of the 50 fallen soldiers. Musicians turned the cries of widows into protest anthems. Murals bloomed on walls, Traoré with tearful eyes. Children saluting drone squadrons, maps of the Sahel ringed with fire. This wasn't blind rage. It was calculated readiness. Traoré's next move was strategic. He ordered the creation of national preparedness centers in all 13 regions of the country, not barracks, but civilian academies. Here, youth are trained not only in defense tactics, but in history, strategy, ideology, and civic duty. At one training center outside Bobo Dioulasso, a 19-year-old woman, Salimata, told a local reporter, "They may have drones. We have memory. We have courage. And now we have both." The High Command, with support from Russian and Malian counterparts, began conducting weekly military drills simulating anti-drone warfare, insurgent infiltration, and border seizure scenarios. Even cyber defense became a priority. Burkina Faso sent its top intelligence officers to Mali, where they now train alongside Russian cyber experts on digital resilience, communications jamming, and electronic surveillance. But perhaps the most significant development wasn't technical, it was philosophical. Inside a private meeting with top generals and Russian advisors, Traoré unveiled what's now being whispered across the Sahel as the African Doctrine of Retaliation. It goes far beyond military response. It's a blueprint for reclaiming African dignity. The doctrine has three core tenets: total self-reliance in defense, no begging, no foreign bases, build what we need, train who we need, strategic disruption, counterattacks not just on the battlefield but in economy diplomacy and information warfare. Civic militarization. Every citizen is a guardian, not through violence but through vigilance, memory, and readiness. Russian advisors helped not just with tactics, but rewrote military training manuals, restructured strategic thinking, and began building a new kind of Burkinabè army, one that thinks before it shoots and defends more than territory, it defends identity. Across the Sahel, murals began to change, no longer just honoring fallen Burkinabè soldiers, but also those from Mali and Niger depicted standing together under one flag: red, gold, black, the new flag of resistance. And with each image, one word echoes louder: unity. What the world witnessed wasn't simply a response to a deadly ambush. It was the ignition of something deeper, a continent no longer asking for help, but declaring its will to survive. Traoré's retaliation isn't a single strike, it's a doctrine, a movement, and it's just beginning. From mourning to mobilization, in most nations the death of 50 soldiers would trigger mourning, maybe protest followed by silence. But in Burkina Faso, grief has become infrastructure, pain has become policy. And what started as a military tragedy has now reshaped the entire civilian-state relationship. Across cities and countryside, the state is no longer seen as a distant institution. It is now a living organism, one that breathes through its people. In marketplaces once filled only with trade and chatter, bulletin boards now host defense schedules. In mosques and churches, the sermon topics have shifted less about salvation, more about sovereignty. Local elders, once respected for their age, now wield influence for something else: strategic knowledge. Neighborhoods have formed civilian watch units, unarmed, unpaid, and highly organized. They track strange movements. They report unfamiliar vehicles. They rehearse evacuation routes and defense positions with a precision that used to belong only to soldiers. One village near the border of Niger has even developed a system of coded drum beats, an ancient practice revived for modern defense alert. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso's education system, change has accelerated. Schools no longer teach only arithmetic and language. They now include civic sovereignty, education, why African borders were drawn, what foreign debt really means, how media narratives are shaped and sold. Students as young as 10 can now identify NATO bases on a map. At 14, they debate the pros and cons of non-alignment. By 16, they write essays not just on the history of colonization, but on the future of Pan-Africanism. This isn't indoctrination. This is self-defense through awareness. President Ibrahim Traoré calls it mental decolonization, and the results are undeniable. Polls taken by independent journalists show a record-breaking 87% public approval for the government's military and civilian coordination. In a region where coups, corruption, and collapse have often been the norm, Burkina Faso now feels organized. But this rising unity has come with significant political consequences. Traoré's government has taken bold steps once considered untouchable: suspension of foreign NGO operations that cannot prove financial transparency, review of all foreign infrastructure contracts, particularly in mining and telecom, nationalization of key industries, especially those related to energy and defense supply chains. The most symbolic move came quietly, but sent shockwaves through the halls of global diplomacy. Traoré ordered a full audit of Burkina Faso's central banking relationships, including agreements tied to the CFA franc. For decades, this currency system has tethered West African economies to the French treasury. Now that tether is being cut. Working with Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso has formally proposed a new regional currency backed not by euros, but by gold reserves and local production output. Inside government circles, they call it the Sahel Standard. If successful, it would mark the first post-colonial currency in Francophone West Africa free from French oversight. But perhaps the most radical shift isn't economic, it's psychological. Citizens no longer view politics as a spectator sport. In town hall meetings, they don't ask, "What will the president do?" They ask, "What role will I play?" Traoré's cabinet, once filled with party elites, now includes veterans, teachers, community organizers, and engineers. Appointments are no longer based on party loyalty, but on service record and community respect. This transformation has sparked something rare in African politics: trust. Not blind loyalty, but active, deliberate trust built on actions, not promises. A woman in Dori, interviewed by an independent Pan-African outlet, put it this way: "We don't follow Traoré because he's strong. We follow him because he's among us. He didn't bring change from above. He pulled it out of us." This collective empowerment is changing how opposition works too. In the past, dissent often came from foreign-funded think tanks or disconnected party leaders. Today, the loudest critiques come from within, from youth groups demanding faster reforms, from women's cooperatives requesting more say in border defense, from artists pushing for media independence. And Traoré doesn't silence them, he invites them in. This is no longer a government for the people. It is increasingly a government by the people. But such change does not come without risk. Western institutions are watching closely. Some see a maverick, others see a threat. International grants are quietly being suspended. French media outlets run daily stories questioning Traoré's mental health, leadership, and intentions. Calls for sanctions have begun to surface in European parliaments. Inside Burkina Faso, however, none of this seems to matter. Because for the first time in living memory, Burkinabè citizens are not waiting to be saved. They are building the future themselves, with hands that farm and defend, with minds that question and organize, and with a spirit that refuses to kneel. The world watches and worries. In Washington, the tone has shifted. What once was described as Burkina Faso's youthful leadership experiment is now labeled a potential source of regional instability. Behind closed doors, think tanks scramble to analyze what they're calling the Sahel realignment. Policy briefings warn that Ibrahim Traoré's doctrine of self-reliance could inspire other African nations to reject foreign military aid, challenge currency dependencies, and even question the legitimacy of global institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and NATO. White House aides reportedly urged African envoys to reopen dialogue with Burkina Faso, but without guarantees of sanctions being off the table. In a recent closed-door meeting, a U.S. diplomat was quoted saying Burkina Faso may become the next Cuba of Africa. At the United Nations, silence echoes louder than statements. While Russia openly praises Burkina Faso's sovereignty, moves and frames Traoré as a symbol of anti-imperialist resistance, Western powers are far more cautious. The African Union's muted response to the attack on Burkinabè soldiers has sparked outrage online. Hashtags like Dan AU Speak Up and When's Africa with Traoré trend across social media, especially among young Africans who feel abandoned by continental institutions. Meanwhile, French media has gone on the offensive. Daily editorials criticize Traoré's youth alliances and lack of democratic structure while avoiding the deeper question: why are millions of Africans standing behind him? European lawmakers have begun floating the idea of soft sanctions, trade reviews, travel restrictions, and strategic aid suspensions. But none of these seem to sway the narrative on the ground in Africa. Because while Western capitals whisper about destabilization, many in the global South see something else entirely: a model. Observers in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe are watching Burkina Faso's transformation closely. What happens when a small, under-resourced nation begins to fight narrative warfare with national pride, digital resilience, and regional cooperation? China has responded with its characteristic pragmatism. Official statements remain vague, but behind the scenes, Chinese diplomats have initiated discreet talks with Burkina Faso to explore potential infrastructure partnerships, this time with more favorable terms and local ownership. It's becoming increasingly clear Traoré is not simply reacting to violence. He is resetting the rules of engagement economically, militarily, and diplomatically. And as he does, one unspoken fear is beginning to circulate through the halls of global power. What if he succeeds? The red line has been drawn. There are moments in history when a single act of violence is meant to break a nation, but in Burkina Faso it did the opposite. 50 soldiers were lost, yes. But something deeper was found. A collective will, a national spine, a red line. Across dusty airfields and quiet villages, people no longer speak of fear, they speak of readiness, and that readiness is no longer measured in bullets and drones, but in memory, discipline, and unity. Traoré's retaliation is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration of independence from foreign dependency, from forced narratives, from the quiet colonization that never truly ended. And that's precisely why global powers are worried, not because Burkina Faso is threatening them militarily, but because it is proving that Africa can stand on its own. The danger now, however, is escalation. If history has taught us anything, it's that when a small nation asserts its dignity too loudly, empires start sharpening their tools, sanctions, propaganda regime, change operations. It begins with labels like radical, unstable, authoritarian. Then comes the isolation. And finally, the attempt to erase the example before it spreads. So let us be clear. This is not just about one country. This is about a continent-wide awakening, and whether it will be nurtured or crushed. As citizens of the world, especially those of us in the West, we must ask hard questions. Are we truly committed to freedom and sovereignty? Or only when it serves our interests? Can we accept an Africa that chooses its own path, even if it doesn't look like ours? And most importantly, do we support leaders who kneel politely, or those who stand with their people? Burkina Faso has drawn the line, not with rage, but with resolve. Now the world must decide whether to cross it or respect it. If this message moved you, please share it. The algorithms won't push it, but you can. Subscribe if you believe that African dignity is not a threat, but a right. And tell us in the comments, do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Or should someone else step forward to carry the torch because the story of retaliation has been written? But the next chapter, that's up to all of us.